Well, hello everyone. My name is Matt Stranick. Really glad to be with you here for the second of the summer reading series on writers and writing. Absolutely stoked, thrilled and stoked, stoked and thrilled to be joined by Dr. Leslie Gruis, who is, among other things, a significant writer. Currently has two books out of nonfiction. I am based in Fort McMurray in Canada, Northern Alberta, not Fredericton, New Brunswick, as is behind me. So, just in case anybody's checking out the video and they're wondering, what the heck am I doing in Fredericton? Well, I'm not. So, there. So again, really glad to have Leslie with us. And among the writing profile, we can also say that Leslie is a very significant civil servant. Is that the correct word? A career of working in the American public service for an organization which in Canada, some people have heard of, I think. It's the American, you call it the National Security Agency. Is that correct? The NSA,
That,
Leslie?
that is correct. The National Security Agency, and we're part of the Department of Defense.
There we go. See, that is something that I myself, as a casual person, did not even necessarily know about that particular partnership, right? How that even plays out. So again, really grateful. I was really pleased when Leslie's book publisher folks kind of reached out to me to speak on the education podcast show. The education show is on somewhat of a hiatus for the summer, but we are certainly deep into our literary series. And personally, I cannot think of two books that are probably more timely or more significant than what we've experienced with what Leslie has out right now beginning in 2020. Her first book is called Privacy, Past, Present, and Future, and that is available on Amazon as well. More recently, 2023, The Privacy Pirates, How Your Privacy is Being Stolen and What You Can Do About It. So, that to me is a really awesome title for a book, for one thing. And both of these books clearly have a lot to say in the significant amount of online space that we give to our lives, right? We spend a lot of our times online, and every time you go online, you are being observed, right? Your activities are being noted, due to just participating in a public worldwide internet. So again, really grateful that you're here with us, Leslie. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for sort of hearing the preamble. Is there anything that I haven't spoken to in that kind of wind up there that you might want to share with folks, Leslie?
Well, Matt, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I would like to add to your opening remarks. Not only are you being watched online and is your data being scraped online, but you're actually being commoditized, right? So all those people that are scraping your data are selling it to other people, or they're getting the benefit of advertisers pitching products to you based on your preferences. And so I'm I'm kind of annoyed at that, right? Why should somebody else monetize my private information? But with that said, of course, I'm very careful about using social media. The only social media I'm actually on is on LinkedIn. So I'm not a Facebook or an X or Instagram user. Obviously, I've fallen down the Amazon rabbit hole with everybody else because I'm a reader, right? I read a lot. And Amazon just makes it too easy for me to just order whatever the newest book is on technology or history or education so I can consume them. So heaven knows what Amazon is already doing with the data it has about my purchasing profile. But there you go.
Well, that is excellent advice and commentary there. Certainly appreciating the wider context. And again, I'm somebody who has a degree in a thing called educational technology, and I've spent a fair amount of my time just sort of studying education as a phenomenon in online environments, including my doctoral research. So everything you're saying now rings out to me, on that level, but then also just very much as a work a day, everyday kind of person who just like anybody else, right? I have pretty significant interactions with the Meta set of apps. I find it significant that you have chosen not to engage with those, which I'm sure we'll get into just a bit more here. But I do have some fairly scripted questions in the interests of getting the maximal value out of this interview. So, just to kind of step back for the benefit of whoever may be listening or watching this podcast or video, I guess like I've seen, as you say, on your LinkedIn, right, that you completed your initial undergraduate sort of study, and then you completed your PhD in mathematics from the University of Chicago, or sorry, not the University of Chicago, from Northwestern University. My apologies. I don't have the LinkedIn tab right in front of me, but it does make me sort of ask, are you from Chicago? Are you from the American Midwest? What sort of path of events sort of led you to the point where you're studying doctoral level math, and then the next year you begin working for the NSA?
So that's an interesting story. I actually grew up in Washington, D.C., but both
Okay.
my parents were from the Midwest. My father was from Chicago, and my mother was from a farm in Indiana. So I spent a lot of time in the Midwest growing up. When I was a little kid, before air conditioning, my mother would take my sister and myself to the Midwest to her father's home because it was a little bit cooler, right? Washington, D.C., for those of you that have never had the pleasure of Washington in the summer, it's a swamp. It's hot, it's humid, it's really unpleasant. There are some days you open the door and it's like a blast furnace to walk outside. So it's understandable why we would go to the Midwest. I will say I was one of those lucky kids that was given free rein to play outside all day long because of those farm experiences. And we're seeing in education today that that's a real problem for kids is they don't get that free play time like they used to. And that's having a deleterious effect on our kids today. So let me go back though to the story because you asked me to finish the story. So I went to school in Washington, D.C. I attended private schools. And then I went to the University of Chicago. It seemed natural to me to go to the Midwest. I had also been on the East Coast for 18 years at that point in time, and I was ready for something different, right? A different set of people and social values. And the Midwest is very different, as I'm sure different parts of Canada are very different. So I was at the University of Chicago as an undergraduate, and then I moved up the Lake Shore to Northwestern University and got my PhD. And after 10 years in Chicago, it was time to come home. So I came back to Washington, D.C.
Government town, strong amount of intellectual class as well as the political class, obviously. There's a really significant music presence there as well, multi generational, in fact. So, just as we're sort of having this conversation, I'm sort of, hearing in my mind sort of, the various cultural elements that have been at play, right? From the American Midwest and then from your hometown of Washington, D.C. That is really significant to me, right? The whole coming back to where you started from in a way to then embark on this significant personal and, you know, professional and other kinds of adventures within your career. So, I mean, in terms of your two books, to sort of move forward across the eras a bit, you're working on a third book now. I think it's fair to say that writing has sort of become a natural extension of your professional practice. I guess I wonder, you're somebody with background in mathematics. Has the relationship to literature or writing always been there for you as well, or is that something that you've sort of come to a bit later on within your life and career?
So there's no way I would have gotten through secondary school or college without being a decent writer, right? Those were skills that were insisted on. There was also required reading in the summer when I was in secondary school, which at the time seemed like a burden, but now I look back on it and I think, wow, all those wonderful classics I read. And I did not read the things that most girls read, right? I'm reading adventure stories like The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo and White Fang and The Last of the Mohicans and things like that. I really didn't like um, Jane Austen at that point in time, things like that. I've come to appreciate them as an older person now, mostly because some of our girls where I tutor are reading books like that in preparation for taking the SAT or the ACT. So we really encourage our kids today to read, and that is very against the grain for kids today, is to read a book. I can't tell you how many battles I've had with fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and on graders about reading a book for the summer. It's an unbelievable burden that I am placing on them. I have one little girl the other day who basically was full of negative attitudes because she's going into sixth grade, right? She's 12. You would have never guessed, right? Um, and it was a battle, but I got her to read 5 pages of a book and write a summary. And she actually wrote a really good summary, which kind of surprised me. So the reading skills are there, right? We just need to get them to exercise them. So that, in answer to your question, that's kind of how we got to the literature thing. Is I had a strong writing background already. I never thought of myself as a great writer until I retired from the government and somebody had said to me, Leslie, you're so interested in privacy. Why don't you just write the book? And so all of a sudden, retired, you're sort of standing there going, okay, what do you do now? My career is over, right? That I'm closing the chapter on 30 years of work. What do I do now? Right? And I'm much too driven a person just to retire and play golf. So I said, okay, well, they said I can write the book. They believe I can write a book. I'm really interested in privacy. I guess I'll write a book. And 3 years later, voila, we have a book. So it was a very interesting adventure for me.
Well, and again, right, I really I appreciate, how you're sort of going back towards your experiences as working with younger people, right? Your literacy sort of tutor and experience in that way. I have, some experiences in that kind of area myself. My family members have a bit. My dad was kind of involved in some literacy, nonprofit kind of stuff off the side of his desk significantly for a lot of his career, actually. So everything that you're saying really resonates with me there. And it does actually lead pretty well into the next question that I had written down here, because I do have to wonder across a 30-year career, to what extent did your work involve mathematical and scientific thinking? And to what extent did your work treat math and science as subjects of study? Do you know what I mean? I mean, I'm sure you know what I mean, but what I mean is, am I expressing that clearly?
I think you're expressing it quite clearly. When I was working at the National Security Agency, I was definitely working as a mathematician. So a lot of my work was very technical, right? I was growing up cutting my teeth at the National Security Agency when the internet came into being in the 90s. It was a very exciting period of time. We first started working in big data way before big data became popular. So I was kind of there. It was kind of cool to have been there and watched all this emerge. The other great thing, of course, was I changed jobs every couple years within the National Security Agency to work in different areas, which was great because it meant I could work in one problem in computer science, and then I could go off and work in a problem in electrical engineering, and then I could go off and work in a problem in computational linguistics, and so it always kept it fresh, right? I was always learning new stuff, and I loved always being challenged like that because as the mathematician, you're the kind of dumb bunny that walks in the room and says, okay, I don't understand any of the vocabulary you guys are using, but I do understand the mathematics that underlies it. So just give me a little time to learn your lingo and I'll be with the program. Right. And I did that again and again and again. And that's why the job never got old. Right. As you get more senior, you're called upon to do other kinds of things. So I did end up working with attorneys a fair amount. And the way that I worked with attorneys was to go to them and explain the capabilities of technology and then figure out how can we use this technology in a way that still respects the individual rights of American citizens, right? So this is where my fascination from privacy comes from. If you ask me for a date as to when I got interested in privacy, I can actually give you a year. It was 1999. We're ramping up to Y2K now, right? 1999, there was a book that came out that year by an attorney, a well-known legal scholar named Lawrence Lessig, called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And it talked about the challenges that the internet was going to pose to privacy, to sovereignty, to government power, to individuals. It had a couple of really interesting case studies in it too. And I just ate up that book when it came out in 1999. And that's where my fascination from privacy really came from, was that book. Does that answer your question?
More than answers my question. I'm sort of thinking about the best way to kind of move that forward, only because it seems like there's a lot of places to go from there. I guess my first general observation about what you mentioned is that the entire history of the internet has been the purview of your career relative to formative times, both in terms of public security and in terms of the internet being a phenomenon. So your notion of sort of studying the phenomenon prior to it sort of coming on to full mainstream usage, right, as a public internet. I mean, to me, of course, it would make sense that defense and sub agencies and various organizations within the Pentagon. I assume I'm using the term correctly. Are going to want to study this thing as it's emerging in real time, and considering that this is a podcast that's going out on what would be considered in 1999 pretty advanced technologies. The amount of distance that we've covered in that period of time from a technology standpoint is significant, but the conceptual problems I think that we're dealing with are still kind of there, right? We're still kind of dealing with fundamental issues of how to respect the individual, how to respect, fundamental rights and freedoms, which are guaranteed to us. We have our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in this country, just like you have your guarantees within your constitutional framing documents. How do you actually respect that in a post privacy kind of society? And again, to me, this is why the kind of work that you have chosen to do since stepping away from the government is really compelling and significant, in my opinion. And so, again, just in terms of your whole experience with literacy, your whole experience as a writer, I guess you've got these two books that have sort of come out since you have retired. I wonder about the motivation, right? I mean, somebody approached you, you didn't really have it in your mind. I mean, you sort of you describe it as somebody approached you, and then 3 years later, the book was ready. I mean, what were you doing sort of in tandem with that? What else was going on that was informing the development of that among perhaps other kinds of projects or activities that you're involved in?
So I retired from the government quite abruptly. It was an abrupt decision.
Okay.
Anybody who works in the government today in the United States understands those kinds of things, right? It's near and dear to their hearts. So my retirement was an abrupt decision. So it's not something I had really planned with, years of dedication, say, on that exact 30-year day, I'm going to retire and I'm going to buy a beach house in Nova Scotia and a fishing boat, right? And I'm going to be a fish. No, no, it was not like that at all. It was a very precipitous decision. Um, so when I left, and it's really scary to retire if you've been working at the same place for a really long time. It's really scary, right? It's like that Indiana Jones scene where you step from the lion's head. It's kind of like that, right? Just got to have faith that something's going to catch you, right? So I had faith, and I had a wonderful boss who I really, really respected, and he was a lawyer. So I was eternally in his office asking him questions about the nuances of US privacy law, which he happily answered because he was a really smart guy. And one day he looked at me and he said, Leslie, why don't you just write the book on privacy? And that was maybe a couple years before I retired. And that idea kind of just stuck in my head. And so when all of a sudden I was retiring and I didn't have a plan, I said, well, Sean told me to write a book on privacy, that I could do it. I said, if Sean believes I can do it, then who would I be to let Sean down, right? So I proceeded to start to work on the book on privacy. Now it was long and complicated because first of all, I'm not a lawyer, right? So I'm not a lawyer in any country, right? I'm a mathematician, right? Lawyers have a wonderful way of putting things. If you read legal language, they try to think of every possible contingent situation and they put it in there, right? So that the contract that they've written is legal and binding and doesn't have any loopholes, which is why your privacy notices are such a nightmare today when you read them or try to read them. So I had to read a lot of English constitutional history, English constitutional law. So I went back to, yes, wait for it, the Magna Carta. So I started back in 1215 with the Magna Carta and started working my way forward to understand where this idea of privacy had come from, because obviously it was something that the New World colonists brought with them, an idea that the New World colonists had brought with them. And yet the word privacy doesn't appear in any of the founding documents of the United States. I found that it was a really interesting puzzle for a mathematician, right? I approached it like a mathematician, right? In a lot of ways, people, I think, get irritated with me because I'm very logical in the way I think. And I'll say, well, why should it be that way? And somebody will say, well, because it always has been. I said, no, not good enough. Why has it been that way? Right. And so I was looking for where did this idea of privacy come from? Right. Where did it come from? Because I can't find it. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. It's not in the Constitution. The word's not in the Bill of Rights. Where is it? Right. And so that's what the 3 years while I was writing the second book or the first book were spent on, was finding the origins of privacy in the United States. So I wasn't doing much of anything else, Matt. I think I started tutoring at that point in time just to have a little bit of pocket money on top of my retirement, right? So that was one thing that kept me sane or insane, as the case may be. But I had this thick book of all the English constitutional and English documents that I was pouring through, which Amazon had brought me as a used book, of course. And so, I had 800 pages or something to delve through. And some of it was not in modern English. Okay. So I really had to work at it. And I had to call friends up. And I belonged to a private club here in DC. So I would go and I would sit and I would wait for somebody to come in the room and I would hope they would be a lawyer because I was going to pepper them with questions about American law and how we got to it because they went to law school, I didn't, right? So whenever I was reading something I would go and get some help if I got myself stuck. So that's how I spent the 3 years. Was there was a little bit of tutoring, but there was a lot of reading and research to understand the history of where privacy came from in America. And in point of fact, the word privacy in the United States law doesn't even show up until 1890, which I found just amazing. But the point was, I discovered along the way, was that privacy is there implicitly in the Bill of Rights. So your right to free speech is a form of privacy. Your right to not be bothered in your home is a right to privacy. Freedom from search and seizure, our Fourth Amendment, is a kind of privacy, right? Habeas corpus, which actually comes out of the Magna Carta, is a right to privacy. So that's the long story of what I was doing with all my idle time. I wasn't sitting around and eating peeled grapes, Matt. I was pouring through all this English constitutional history, trying to understand enough about the history in order to understand the context in which these things were being written. So I had to learn a lot of English history along the way too, so I could understand the events that were driving the decisions that were being made. And this wasn't just, of course, laws from Parliament. This was proclamations from the king, right? It was court decisions. It was the whole ball of wax all in one. It was a great research project and a wonderful puzzle to unravel for this mathematician.
Well, thank you for that. Again, there's a lot to sort of you could sort of zoom in on from what you just described. Certainly, when you're sort of to put you forward your sort of notion about your supportive supervisor, right? Your colleague who sort of put it in your idea in the first place. I think that actually speaks to mentorship pretty significantly. We've talked on the education podcast about sometimes, at least in Canadian higher education, that mentorship is sort of hard to come by a bit sometimes. So when you are talking about having this really positive collegial work-based relationship as sort of the origin story informing this project, right? The first book, which then led into a second book, which now is again leading into something else that you're involved in. I certainly appreciate that aspect of what you described. And again, right, just sort of the notion of contextual validity, right? I don't know necessarily very much about the field of working in American national security spaces, obviously, but when I was sort of just doing my educational doctorate kind of training, it was very much the case of, the phenomena that you're investigating is contextually bound, and you have to understand the operational concepts and jargon in order to participate meaningfully. So when you talk about, sort of working in these sort of different subject matter areas across your field, right, you sort of take your skill set as a mathematician and then apply it to the given problem or circumstance. Again, I sort of see that as well. That's what educators do, right? You sort of take your educational kind of training and knowledge, and then take, whether it's science or math or English or social studies or whatever, and you sort of put that sensibility towards it, right, towards the service of the discipline. So again, I sort of see some pretty neat kind of affinities, I suppose, just between what you've described within the course of your career. And then again, my experience as an educator and an English teacher, actually, for a lot of years, is that every book is sort of a product of a community. So you, Leslie, are the personal writer. You are definitely the author of such work. But again, just what you described, right? Checking in with friends, checking in with acquaintances, people at your private club that you belong to, just kind of picking people's brains, right? Asking, does this sound right to you? Those sort of incremental but highly necessary contributions from others turn the book into something that belongs to the community, right? A community kind of based cultural endeavor. So again, I appreciate everything you sort of shared there in terms of how that came to be. Was there much that you learned from writing the first book that you put into the service of the second book? Was the second book, the writing, the production, easier? Was it less of a learning curve? How were those two projects related, if I can ask?
Sure. So the first book is, 340 pages long, and it's more like an academic book or a textbook, right? It's not going to have popular appeal, right? Sorry, I'm just not Ron Chernow. I can't, write stunning biographies on characters from American history that hit the bestsellers list, right? That are, 700 pages long, right? So I accept the fact that the first book would not sell well, but that's not important. What was important about was learning the material, the exercise, and succeeding and getting it published, right? Or as my husband, who is also a writer, among other things, says, it's your best business card. So, so having written the first book and feeling now like I kind of have the privacy subject in American history almost by the tail, I almost kind of understand what's going on. Not as well as a lawyer because I'm not a practicing lawyer, but enough. I decided I would write a popular version of that book. And so I took the first book and I squeezed out all the superfluous stuff. And it became the second book with one notable addition. The second book, I was really thinking about how young people don't like to read, right? So I was thinking about that. So I put, as a sort of a way to help draw the reader through the book, I put a storyline in the book about a 14-year-old girl and her family and the obstacles they face with respect to privacy over the course of a few weeks' time, right? So the girl, who's named Alice, of course, uh, uh, has some racy pictures of her put up on the web inadvertently, and her father is incensed. Her father is an attorney, and her father discovers there's nothing he can do about it, right? And so it's meant to sort of drive home the idea that this is happening to real people today, right? These privacy violations are commonplace. It's not just one person. Everybody is giving away a little bit of their privacy. And the end message of the book, as with the first book, is privacy is essential to democracy. In the United States, we enumerated the rights that people reserved from the government as a way of controlling our government, right? It's so it doesn't turn into a tyranny or a sovereignty, right? If you don't exercise your privacy rights, then you're undermining our democracy. And that's the message I want people to take away, is that you should value it. It's precious.
That is absolutely significant. And I think actually, when this podcast makes its way to LinkedIn, which is a place that I have a pretty significant following, a lot of practitioners in my area of education, which is to say Canadian higher education, and generally within the learning technology space, within the open education movement, there are some pretty conscious decisions being made by people to move towards or try and utilize technologies that are less, or sorry, maybe more privacy compliant, right? Less privacy invasive. So whether it's, perhaps using like, Firefox as a web browser, or making use of some of these specifically more open source applications when it comes to productivity suites, or, things like WordPress based websites, as opposed to, relying strictly on social media apps for your messaging. There are things that can be done, I think, pretty widely across people's daily lives, where they can make some incremental adjustments which enhance their ability to keep their privacy. So I think, what you're describing from your experience of both these books, but particularly the second one, is that it is practical, it is actionable, and that people actually do have a fairly robust set of options available to them when it comes to being proactive about maintaining their privacy. Is how I would like to see the message here. The optimistic kind of takeaway. I really am appreciative of your time, and I don't want to keep, this going for terribly too long, because you've been very gracious thus far. But I have to wonder, I mean, you mentioned that you have sort of taken on some tutoring in your retirement, literacy sort of tutoring. I mean, do you have did did you have children who went through K to 12? Did you have, like, the interest in sort of moving now towards STEM education? I notice that there is some mention on your web presences of having a particular interest in STEM and girls in middle or junior high school kind of area. Again, if you wanted maybe just to speak to the education piece of that a bit, I'd be really interested to hear more about that.
Okay, so this all started as an effort to make a little pocket money. That's how this all started,
Okay.
right? To give back to my community also, right? So in the United States, if you want to go to university, many universities, not all universities, requires students to take the SAT or the ACT, and there's a long debate going on about that right now. But anyway, I tutor a lot of SAT and ACT students, so those are all high school age kids, right, that we're tutoring. And then it started as math, right? I thought I was going to tutor math. Well, then they said, oh, well, you've got a book out. You should teach English too. And I said, okay, I'll teach English. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm not a grammarian, but okay, we'll figure it out. So then it became physics. So then I was teaching physics. So then it became US history. And I thought, okay, I can kind of wing that, right? And they said, how about world history? I said, sure, why not? Right? It just kind of keeps going on like that. And then I started getting the middle school students. And then I started getting the really little kids. Now, to be fair, I did have a child. I have a son. Um, and he was a challenge. He was very bright and very loquacious and emotionally, we had a lot of issues we had to work on. So I'm very familiar with little boys. I get little boys, right? So this was not a bridge too far, really. I just had to resurrect all those parenting skills that I had had. The other thing that was near and dear to my heart was, while I was at NSA, we had had something called the Women in Mathematics Symposium. And the reason we had it was because we weren't getting enough women mathematicians being recruited into our pipeline. And there were lots of studies about why there weren't more women in mathematics and in STEM. But one of the dominant theories at that point in time, one of the dominant findings was that we lose girls at that middle school age. So that 11, 12, 13, we lose them in their proficiency with the math and the sciences for whatever reason. So that is really my sweet spot in my tutoring, is to find those girls. They can be 11, 12, or 13. They can be like my 16-year-old high schooler that was really struggling with SAT math. And I finally figured out she couldn't add fractions. Okay. Once I figured out she couldn't add fractions, we fixed that problem. And she did beautifully after that. But girls don't necessarily stand up and say, this is what I really can't do. I need some help here, right? You have to find out what it is they're having problems with and give it a name, right? I was working with a kid the other day. Every single problem, it was a trig type problem. Every single problem involving a tree and a shadow or a ladder and a wall, all those shadow problems, as you call them, this kid just had a mental block about shadow problems. And so I called it out, right? I said, look, you've got yourself convinced you can't do these problems, and you can't. I said, now I'm going to do 5 in a row for you. And then we're going to practice these for homework. And before you know it, you're going to be able to do this like nobody's business. And this is never going to be a problem for you again. Right? So it's establishing that personal connection to each kid to find out what's going on. Right? What is it that's causing the stumbling block? What is it they're not understanding? Are they a different kind of learner than the way this material is pitched? Right? I had my 3-dimensional solids out yesterday for a senior who was trying to figure out the surface area of a cube, and I handed him a cube, right? And I said, here, put it in your hand, turn it around. How many sides? 6, good. How are we going to find the surface area, right? I made them think through it because you got to cultivate that spatial intelligence, which is something that engineering schools are finding that some students don't have. Right? So every kid is different, right? But I try to give a personal approach to it so that they can overcome whatever obstacle it is they're facing and we can move on.
Well, again, that is absolutely a really fascinating insight to me into your sort of emergent pedagogical practice. And as you were sort of describing your approach, right, I found myself thinking really, I've been thinking this really throughout our conversation, that mathematics is itself sort of its own form of literacy. There's a really awesome couple of books out by the late author Cormac McCarthy, the late American author, and the last published of his novels actually feature a teenage girl protagonist who's also a mathematical genius. It's a 2-part novel, and it deals with this person and her brother, and the brother is kind of a different sort of character, but part of the key aspect of the novel is that this girl really struggles with the fact that math exists in its own space, that at some point, in her case, she just can't see the intersection with physical lived reality. And it causes a great deal of problems for her. So when you're talking about, girls sort of not really having the sense of themselves to sort of speak up and just say, hey, here's my issue, some of that to me is cultural conditioning. We treat girls differently than we do boys. It's like, just smile, will you? Just like, can't you just smile? And so you don't necessarily advocate for yourself. And so, yeah, again, you get attrition from trades and areas and programs that, just with a little bit of guidance, such as you are providing, um, you can help bridge that gap a little bit. So, again, everything you describe really kind of resonates on a literary level and on an educational level, which is awesome. So I appreciate that. Leslie, we are into our 44th minute of conversation. I would just like to say again, many thanks for being here. Was there anything else that you wanted to speak to address our sort of audience for the video and/or audio outputs for this before we sort of wind down our conversation?
So there's one other thing I wanted to mention, and since you were mentioning characters from books, it reminded me of a character from Jurassic Park.
Okay.
So the hero, the mathematician, of course, Dr. Ian Malcolm, when he gets to Jurassic Park, kind of looks around and he says, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. So I would just say that with respect to the emerging debate about I honestly believe we need to be cautious. We also need to make sure that our kids understand values and ethics, civic responsibilities, because they're going to be the designers of these engines in the future. So the more we can make them aware, the sort of rights and wrongs, right? I know people are enchanted with technology as the solution to all things, but sometimes it might be worth stopping and pausing and thinking about, is this something we really want to do? Do we really want to go down this path? And I would say that's very true in the United States for digital education. When we look at secondary school kids who all have school issued computers, I would be the very difficult parent if my child was still young enough to be in public school that would refuse to accept a school issued computer, because I don't know how they're looking at my kid, how they're monitoring his activities, what they're doing with the data. I don't know. And it's not like they publicize that. And yet I sign away his privacy right when we accept that computer at the beginning of the year. So I'm not so sure one laptop per child is really a great idea. And I wish somebody would just stop and think about it a little bit before going off gun ho about it and saying, well, it's technology, it must be great.
I could not agree with you more, Leslie, on that. I have children who are in their K to 12 years and who do, in fact, use Google Suite as the product of choice within their school district. I've spent actually time doing just Google Suite administrator education training for education as part of some PD. And again, I can tell you that everything you're saying about sort of public contracts for private sector services vis-a-vis the educational training spaces, vis-a-vis technology, sort of aimed at very young students, very impressionable people who don't necessarily have strong self concepts, or people who don't necessarily have, the technology or cultural literacies to necessarily understand the magnitude of their own actions within these electronic virtual environments. So again, everything you've said about sort of reinforcing good citizenship, good moral value, having those sort of attributes and attitudes in place before you give a kid, basically keys to the entire public internet, so to speak, is certainly valid, right? Everything you said really rings out very strongly in everything we've said, everything that you've shared with us these past 48 minutes. And so, Leslie, again, much respect and appreciation for being here. Thank you tremendously. I'm going to strongly recommend that everybody, you especially, you who's watching this, do need to go to amazon.ca.com, whatever your retailer of choice. We will have the publishers' websites, of course, for both of these books. And we'll definitely have a link to Leslie's LinkedIn, because I have looked at it and there's you have some awesome content up there, right? In addition to everything else that's going on. Leslie, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it a lot. Is there anything else you
Thank
wanted
you,
to say
Matt.
before we?
Thank you, Matt,
Absolutely.
so much. Just remember that privacy is essential to democracy.
100%. Appreciate it very much. That seems like a really good way to go out. I'm going to end the recording now. Take care, everybody. Bye for now.